Welcome to the Black Magic Woman podcast book club series with your host, Mandanara Bales.
Welcome to the Black Magic Woman book club. It is a series where I'm going to drop one podcast every month, which is basically a conversation with a First Nations author. So I'm your host, Mandanara Bales, and I'd like to say Wadamuli, which is greetings in my father's Birigaba language. I'd also like to pay my respects and acknowledge the Kabi Kabi peoples, where I get to work, live and raise my children here on the beautiful Sunshine Coast. I'd also like to acknowledge their elders, past and present, and acknowledge that this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. We have never ceded our sovereignty as First Nations peoples living in this country, now known as Australia. And in terms of just the podcast, it's not just a podcast, but it's an opportunity for me to showcase First Nations peoples, authors, writers, publishers, creators from all around the country. Maybe it might be First Nations people globally. We just stick to our mob because there's plenty of our mob in our own backyard that we can showcase. This idea actually came from an episode from my Black Magic Woman podcast with a yarn with Professor Anita Heiss, who is joining me today. So my sister, I just want to say, from that conversation when you basically said, why don't you start the Black Magic Woman book club for episode 1, it's obviously fitting, but I just want to say we put it out there to the universe and look what's happening.
Well, Mandangu for manifesting that yourself, Mandanara, and I'm really, really excited for you. I'm excited for your listeners and viewers. I'm excited for First Nations literature in this country, and I'm excited to be here with you today. It's a lot of excitement.
I love it. Now let's keep up this energy. This is very new, this vodcast, video cast, but we're ready to go. And I just want to say to listeners really quickly, that it's different to the Black Magic Woman podcast where it's a conversation. Yes, we're going to have one, but this is a little bit more structured with some questions. And I could tell you now, I have been prepping for weeks. I have done more prep and put more time into this podcast than I have for my last 5 blocks of my MBA. So I'm ready to go. And I just want to kick it off, Anita, with a few standard questions that I'm going to ask all of my guests. So since you are an author, writer, I'm going to start with this. Are there any books or authors that inspired you to become a writer?
Well, there are many, but the two, and I wished I had grabbed their books off my bookcase now. I would say the late Dhuuluu-Yala, obviously, who was born Kath Walker and changed her name to Dhuuluu-Yala as a protest against the bicentenary. Her collection of poetry, We Are Going, was the first collection of poetry by an Aboriginal person in Australia to be published back in 1964. And I reach for that all the time. There's an Aboriginal Charter of Rights in that collection that I think is as valid today as it was back then. But she wrote across genres. She was an activist, a painter, an artist. She wrote kids' stories and so forth. And I just loved the power of her voice and her just her strength in telling the world what they need to know about us as a people, as a nation, or many nations. And the other person would be the late Auntie Ruby Langford-Guinevere, beautiful Bundjalung woman whose autobiography, she wrote her first book at the age of 50, and her autobiography, Don't Take Your Love to Town, came out in 1988, the same year as Sally Morgan's My Place, which, sold many, many, many more, and most people have read, and a very different memoir. But those two women, Auntie Ruby and Wiradjuri, I just think really pushed the boundaries in Australian publishing and in Australian literature. And if all your listeners or your viewers, if you are a writer, you want to be a writer, particularly if you're a First Nations person, you must read those pioneers.
All righty. So what books did you actually grow up with, or what books did you grow up reading?
Okay, Mandanara. Okay, confession time.
Here we go.
I didn't read as a child. I didn't come from a home with books. My mum read the Bible. She still reads the Bible. My father never read. The 70s growing up was very different. We were out on the street playing cricket and footy and tennis. People weren't indoors watching Netflix and playing TV games. We had Atari or something like that. So as a young person, even till I got into high school, people were out and being more active, I think, after school and on weekends than they are today. So I had a reading age of 16 at the age of 12 because we were tested, but I didn't fall in love with reading, and this is the honest truth, until I started doing my PhD and started reading First Nations literature. And I was in my mid-20s then.
I can relate to that, Anita. When I was writing these questions, I actually thought to myself, I bet you any money she didn't grow up reading, because we didn't grow up reading, even though our parents always emphasised the importance of education. You need to read, you need to learn this, you need to go to school, because of those opportunities that weren't, that they weren't able to participate in education. What books do you enjoy reading? Tell me.
Before we move on, this is going to take hours, but with you just saying them, Anna, you should ask yourself these same questions at some point, okay? Just throwing it back at you. Okay, what books do I enjoy reading? I love reading, obviously, First Nations authors. I love particularly, and I think because we didn't have books growing up as kids, I read nearly every single picture book by a First Nations author that comes out. I think Magabala does the best. And I think I love those because I didn't have them as a kid, but also because most of those stories reclaim and maintain culture and language, and there's morals and so forth. I love historical fiction, and I love reading. I love reading fiction, particularly if I'm down the beach or at the pool or on holidays and so forth.
I was going to say really quickly, Auntie Patsy Cameron and Sea Country, and there's another author there, Lisa Kennedy. Is it Lisa
Another
Kennedy?
view of that shows a difference of kids growing up today and then down on Flinders Island and so forth.
Yes.
Yeah.
But that's Tiger Lily's favourite book, so I bought 4 of them, and I have been giving them as presents. I've been giving them as presents at children's birthday parties. All right, ready? What book or books are you currently reading?
Okay, I do have these handy because my breakfast bar is covered in books. I'm currently reading the funniest book I've read, Dial A for Aunties, right? Ooh. So it's actually by an Indonesian American Singaporean author, but it's so funny because it's about dating and about how the aunties argue with each other, and it's just hilarious. I don't want to give too much away. It's Dial A for Aunties by Jessie Sutanto, but I recently read, obviously, Jackie Huggins's re-release.
Yes.
How do I do that?
Yes, there it is, Sister Girl.
Yeah, 24 years later. And then I went on to read Jack of Hearts, which is the book about her father that she wrote with Nairi. So it'd be great if you could talk to them at some stage.
And Nairi is her sister?
Nairi Jarrow, of course, is her sister. So they wrote about their father who died in the war. I received it in the post yesterday. It's just from Magabala.
I got mine too. Yes. Yep,
so looking forward to getting upper primary. That's probably an upper primary book or a reluctant reader book in Year 7 for the people who have kids. And Professor Fredericks gave me everything you need to know about the Uluru Statement from the Heart for Christmas. So I've got to get into that. But my to-be-read pile is 2 bookcases.
I love it. Well, guess what? I'm telling you now, we do another yarn in the next 6 months. You're going to find that I'm going to try and get through every single one of your books. That's been a commitment. I know I'm going to get through.
Books?
No, all the books that you've written, I want to read them. I'm actually setting myself a task to read 1 book a week. So 6 months' time, let's get back to that and see if I've read them all. So if you could be mentored by a famous author, who would it be?
Years and years and years ago, before I was in the position I'm in now, I always thought to myself, I want to be mentored by J.K. Rowling. But in recent times, J.K. Rowling has said some things that are highly inappropriate. So only because she was so successful as an author who couldn't get a book published by anybody and then went crazy. Toni Morrison.
Mm-hmm. So for people that don't know J.K. Rowling, she is the author of that mystical Harry Potter
series.
You could tell I don't read.
I'd like to be mentored maybe by Maya Angelou. Obviously, people need to be living, but if I could have some Maya Angelou or Toni Morrison, I would say obviously people in Australia, but my peers, I think we sort of mentor each other at that level now.
Alrighty. What about in terms of your favourite blogs or websites for writers?
Oh, okay. Well, what I would say is, as a recommendation, look, you should be subscribed to mailing lists from the Australian Society of Authors. Always check there for what's happening in the industry, the local writers' centre and so forth. I really follow the authors that I like on Instagram, and I join their Facebook pages, and I just watch what they post, and many of them will talk about their writing process and what they're reading. Get into the Global Online Book Club on Facebook. There's so many groups you can join. So find out what you're interested in, whether it's poetry. There are Black writing groups online as well. So I don't necessarily have particular blogs I can recommend. My recommendation is to follow the authors who you enjoy reading, because they will talk about their process and so forth.
Alrighty. And I just realised that I didn't even do your introduction. And I said at the start, it's different to Black Magic Woman when my guests introduce themselves. So I'm going to go back now, Anita. I love the fact that we've got some amazing insights into a little bit about you, and I guess it's going to lead into the book that we're going to talk about, which is Am I Black Enough for You 10 Years On? But really quickly, I'm going to talk about you now, Anita, if you don't mind. So Anita is a proud member of the Wiradjuri Nation of Central New South Wales and is one of Australia's most well-known authors. As an advocate for Indigenous literacy, Anita has worked in remote communities as a role model, encouraging young Indigenous Australians to write their own stories. She's performed her work and lectured on Aboriginal literature at universities, conferences, consulates and embassies across the world. And Anita is a lifetime ambassador for the Indigenous Literacy Foundation, which we will be talking about, and a proud ambassador of the Go Foundation and Warrara Aboriginal College. Anita is a professor of communications. I knew you were a professor, but I did not know that you actually are at the University of Queensland. You've got a job there. I thought you just kind of fly in and out and do your thing. But you're actually at the University of Queensland, and you're on the board of the National Justice Project, the University of Queensland Press, Aboriginal Art Co. and Circa Contemporary Theatre. You love chocolate, same. Running, not yet. And being a creative disruptor. And there's so much in that in terms of, you shared a lot about yourself in terms of who you are and where you grew up, and a lot about your childhood and stuff. So if people want to go back and have a listen at our episode on the Black Magic Woman podcast to catch up, then I would recommend you do that. Otherwise, you can also Google Anita. I'm pretty sure there's a lot you can find on Google. But I actually now want to talk about your book. And it's a book that you actually published 10 years ago. Can I quickly ask the question, how did you come up with the title?
Oh, do you know, I don't know that anybody's ever asked me that before. I think what it was back in the day, because it's 10 years ago now, and obviously I started writing it prior to it coming out in 2012. But I was writing the book prior to what most people will know as the Bolt case, and the 9 of us going to court against Andrew Bolt around some articles he wrote about, 18 of this in total, I believe, from memory. And I think it was this idea that I had to go, originally it was called Contemporary Koori Woman. And then, obviously we have the court case, and I'm sitting there in court and, going through a legal process over 2 years. And it's this realisation that I have to defend and prove my Aboriginality in a court of law for a non-Indigenous journalist and the media and so forth, because they've made these accusations. And so I guess it was sort of like, it's a rhetorical question. I don't want people coming up and answering it to me, although, of course, I've had lots of racists email me and say, no, you're not black enough for me. But then they'll call me the N-word or something. So they're a bit confused. So it's really what I want with the title is for readers to look inward and go, oh, in my preconceived idea of what an Aboriginal person is she black enough for me? Because she doesn't look like that she should, or she's a professor and she lives in the city, and in Andrew Bolt's view,
you wear lipstick, and the Pajero.
And what was that?
The Pajero and the lipstick. That black fella said to you. He could not believe that you're not a black fella because you wear lipstick and drive a Pajero.
Drive a Pajero. I'm like, since when did makeup and a vehicle determine? I mean, so it wasn't just non-Indigenous people; it's blackfellas as well. But that was about his view. That was about him. It wasn't about me at all. I was like, that is the most bizarre thing I've ever heard. But so at the time it was sort of like, am I black enough for you? Because I'm black enough for me, but am I black enough for you? I know who I am. And so I think the title has worked really well in terms of, I hope, generating discussion amongst book groups or classrooms or whatever, but also for people to look internally about how they've been conditioned to believe how we are and what we should be and what we should look like and so forth.
And I would say, Anita, as soon as I read the title, I connected with it because I've always had to justify my Aboriginality or my cultural identity to people every single day. Shopping yesterday, beautiful ladies, not going to name the store, probably listening to the podcast because they're going to look it up. And when the lady found out that I was Aboriginal, she goes, oh, you must be, no, she said, are you a part Aboriginal? And I just finished a workshop, wanted to do some shopping, get back to work and do another workshop, and I didn't. It's exhausting having to define our Aboriginality. But that book, in terms of the title, I'm pretty sure for a lot of us black fellas that don't look like our ancestors, we connected with that. And we're not black enough to be black, and then we're not white enough to be white. So sometimes there's this struggle.
It's funny because at the Adelaide Writers' Week this week, there was a question from the audience, and that was, to all the authors, what's one question you hope you never hear again? And I said, which part Aboriginal are you? Because people still do that, in various forms like you got at the shops.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to go jump into the book now. On the second page, I love your description of yourself in particular, a concrete Koori with Westfield dreaming, and I apologise to no one. Boom. That was like mic drop. Talk to me about that.
Well, again, that was 10 years ago, and I guess it was just making a statement that I accept and embrace and live in the person that I am. I'm not trying to be something I'm not. I'm not whacking ochre on, for the purposes of looking like or being someone else. If I'm doing that as part of ceremony with mob, that's completely different. But otherwise, I am an urban dweller. I grew up between Long Bay Jail, Malabar Sewerage Works and Oracle Industrial Estate. I'm proud of who I am. I live on someone else's country. I understand I have responsibility as a manager there, as a guest. But Westfield dreaming, it was just a joke. Some people get offended by it. I think we're allowed to laugh as well. Concrete Koori, I live in the city, and, I probably use it less now, but back in the day, I was known as affectionately as that. And it was a place for me to speak from when I went into classrooms where kids and teachers, and I will say it, I hate saying it, but Queensland was so far behind New South Wales in the education that when I would go into classrooms, I'd be horrified at how little students knew, but also how little teachers knew about the demographics of our mob and where we live and the professions we have and so forth. So I guess I start from that position saying, yes, you can look like me. Yes, you can dye your hair and drive a fancy car or whatever and still be black. And, I guess that's what that was about.
I love it. And even going back and reading about your grandmother, I absolutely loved it because I connected with it again in terms of my nan was a Kooda girl and your grandmother grew up in Cootamundra. So for people that are listening, you wrote, there's this sense of commitment and obligation to do what you do in life, your position and your privilege to help others. So making the most of the rights that our people have fought for. And I've got goosebumps. It's just reading that out straight from your book. And I'm going to quote your book and what you've said, especially what's resonated with me, but what I think that's also resonating with other black fellas around the country. So Cootamundra, I'm going to let you tell just a little bit in terms of your grandmother and in terms of that quote.
So I got a little bit of emotional just when you were talking about it there, because every day, like you and I having this yarn right now and all this technology, and we live in the city and we live good lives, is a reminder of the privilege that we have compared to so many others, and obviously compared to our old people and even just one generation before us. And I think for me, so my grandmother was removed under the Act of Protection, which did very little to protect our people at all. Around she was born around 1906. She was removed at the age of about 5 or 6 to Cootamundra Aboriginal Girls' Home, where your grandmother was. We should see if there's any overlap of time there. But then she was taken at the age of 11 to the home of the Good Shepherd in Sydney. In a West, I think it was, in Sydney, and then she went into service, and she wasn't reunited with her family till she was, I think, 18 or 20 from memory. And she met my grandfather through my great aunt when she was walking through the botanical gardens, and, you know, this black fella says to this other black fella, "Are you Aboriginal?" And they start talking, and anyway, so they work out this connection and everything. So I got in my hands at home here, I've got letters between my grandmother and my grandfather while she was in service and so forth. And I think for me, and he's writing, I wish I was there to help you with all those meals and so forth and all the cleaning. So I get a real glimpse into the life that she had as a domestic servant compared to the life that I have today. And, you know, so then Mum was born on a Rambi mission in Cowra, also under the Act of Protection. And, you know, went to the mission school there and so forth until she went to Brungle, where all my aunts and uncles were born and raised on that mission or that station. And so I think, you know, I grow up in Matraville. I've got 2 parents who value education. I have all the things that they didn't have in terms of, you know, stability, and they had the rights to raise me, and we had access to health and so forth. And so I feel like my whole life feels like this need to honour the sacrifices that my parents made, but also the lives that my old people lived and fought for rights that we have. You know, we're still fighting for rights. You know, you and I are probably having conversations still today that I used to have, going, I hope my kids don't have to have these conversations. You know, in 10 years' time, hopefully we'll have a voice to Parliament and all those sort of things. But I just feel like I have to use the education that my parents sacrificed so much for to do what I do.
But I love it, because a lot of us black fellas, I would say, feel the same. We feel this deep sense of obligation and responsibility to make the most of the opportunities that are presented to us, and not to fail, not to give up, not to quit, or even not to complain. Because, like, we don't have it as bad as our old people. So you feel like that you can't complain about whatever it is that's going on in your life, because you keep comparing yourselves to the older generations and what they went through.
That's another whole podcast. You know, you just made me think about, so for the listeners out there who are menopausal or perimenopausal, I wrote something for a friend's book, a non-Indigenous person, and it made me think about the fact that my mother never complained about menopause, but of course she went through it. And I thought, I wonder if our Aboriginal women complain less about, you know, what I call puberty for grown-ups, because we've always just had to get on with it.
Yeah.
You know, to complain about something that's happening naturally to us anyway. Like, what is the point of that? I think now, because we have drugs and we have, you know, specialists and so forth. But I think this notion of complaining is really a modern day thing. I think there's a difference between our old people fighting for justice and speaking about their rights to complaining about mundane things every day.
Of course. And talking about your mum, Elsie. So being Elsie's daughter, I absolutely love the part where you talk about your mum and dad and how they met, and your dad being an Austrian man and you Australian, who could barely speak English, falling in love with your mum. I love the fact that she used to go to the dances and he'd wait outside for her and take her home. Just that love, Anita. I was like, I can't even talk about your dad. And I tried not to write too much about your dad, because I started to think about my dad, and his anniversary was only 3 days ago. But I absolutely love how your dad supported you. when you're over in his home country, and you're ringing up backpack and you need some extra money. And what does he tell you about? Switch your champagne and maybe drink beer.
Yeah. He was okay the first couple of times. I paid every cent back. He kept a very strong ledger of IOUs, and he was like, I was so homesick. I literally hadn't even arrived in Europe. I stopped in Hong Kong and was ringing up crying, and I'm saying to Mum, "Don't tell Dad, don't tell Dad." She said, "His father's right next to me. We're in bed," and she's like, "Just come home, baby." Anyway, but he was the first couple of times. So I run out of money, and he was okay, and then he got cranky. He was like, "You need to stop drinking champagne. You have to drink beer." I'm like, "Beer's expensive too, Dad." But my father was quite extraordinary, and he was not quite extraordinary. He was extraordinary. And just listening to you then, I think to myself, people often wonder why I'm single, and it's because I grew up in a house with parents, with a father who adored and cherished my mother the way he did, who never got in the way of politics at all, knew that his job was to support, but never assumed he had a right to comment. I'm sure he had an opinion. Everyone has an opinion. And I think, and he just... my mum keeps a shrine to him at home, and as far as she's concerned, they're still married, and she's quite frail now, and sometimes she'll walk past the little shrine and she'll say, "I'll see you soon, Joe." And, I think we talk about passing and death now because she's getting on, and she's like ready to go and meet Dad in the sky. And I think that kind of love, like that absolute love between two completely different cultures. Like you said, my father couldn't even speak English when he met my mum, and all the Koori women would just giggle because they thought he sounded funny, and he'd wait outside, and all the Koori men felt slighted, they got married in St Vincent's Church in Redfern. And to me, like, theirs is just this beautiful love story. Like, it's a beautiful love story, and I want that. And probably now at my age, it's a good chance I'm never going to have that.
No, he set the bar high, and I could tell you, Anita, when I first met my husband, Peace, and brought him home to introduce him to my dad literally said to my sisters that Ma has now set the standard. Bring someone home like him and I'll be happy. Poor Dad, bless his soul, wasn't really happy.
How did they go?
No.
How did they go, sisters?
Not good at all. Not good at all. Poor Dad was not only disappointed, but because I've got no brothers, it's like having 8 sisters. Poor Dad had to deal with all of these boys and men that were not the nicest people to my sisters. So, yeah, Dad always said 8.
How many?
Wow, no brothers. So poor Dad, very protective. But, yeah, he just wanted us to be looked after, to be loved, and to be treated with respect. And for most of my sisters, it's never happened. In my past, I've experienced it as well. But when I found my Mr. Right, I know you got a book about that, not finding Mr. Right. I know we're going to do another podcast later and talk about other books. But what I want to say really quickly is that sacred time with your mum, because I lost my mum 21 years ago, and every Mother's Day, which is the day that I met my husband on, our mothers are both buried at the same cemetery at Mount Gravatt in Brisbane. His mum's from Fiji, my mum's from Redfern, and they're both in Queensland at the same cemetery, and we meet on Mother's Day. We got married on my dad's birthday because I was sick of spending Mother's Day at the cemetery. I just couldn't feel it within me to be happy, to be loved and pampered when I was still grieving, and he was still grieving. So, in terms of in your book, you write about your Boxing Day sales. Let's go back.
Wait a minute. If I was going to write another chick lit novel, but I'm not too old for that, I would now have to have somewhere in that dating strategy where she goes to a cemetery on Mother's Day to meet some guy.
Well, that was the joke with my husband. I said, we've probably been at the cemetery on Mother's Days and you're just there and I just didn't notice you because we're too busy grieving. But we were in the right place at the right time. Our mums... We always say that our mums brought us together. So tell me about this Boxing Day with you and your mum, that sacred time you talk about, one day a year. It's my favourite day, shopping as well.
Yeah, so we used to go out to Miranda. It was called Miranda Fair in the old days. There's a big Westfield there now, which requires a GPS system to get around. But I don't know, Ryan, we did it for over a decade, and that was what we'd do. We'd save up, and we'd go out early in the morning, and sometimes we'd have to fight for a car space. It was a complete routine. We did the same thing every year, and then we'd start with a coffee at this coffee shop, and then we'd go to Myer, and she'd go to Miller's, and we'd have exactly the same meal, which was an open hamburger in the same cafe. We'd finish it. She'd race in a Target on the top floor, and we'd be done and dusted in about 4 hours, and we'd have lots of bags of shopping and everything. And then, one year Mum invited my brother's then girlfriend, who I loved. Like, I loved her, but that was it really upset me because it just really upset me because that was our thing. And he was this, I'm going to use the word interloper, but I loved her. But at the time, it was like, he's an interloper. And then I think we went once or twice more. And then, when did we stop going? We must have stopped going when I came up here, when I moved to Queensland in 2015. It must have been the last time. 2014, we must have been the last time we went. But it was just something I really loved doing. It was our time, and then it was done.
I just loved it.
That's all we did all the time, but it was our ritual. That was our annual ritual. You looked forward to it. I mean, I lived around. Yeah, and I lived around the corner, 4 meters from my parents, so I saw them nearly every day. But this was one outing that was just ours, tradition.
And the rugby league, right? The Redfern Rabbitohs, which I grew up calling them, not South Sydney, because I honestly believe that they were called the Redfern Rabbitohs, who are still our fans, who's still our team, except for my husband's a Rooster supporter, poor fella. But also the Sydney Swans.
Justers.
You're a big Sydney Swan supporter. How do you go from AFL to NRL? Do you just easily adapt?
No, I'm not a huge football person per se, but I grew up in a house where the Rabbitohs were, and I'm like cousins who were just literally crazy when if they lose, you cannot be in the same house as them. Elsie, Mum, is my God, watching her like sitting in the room, we'll be messaging each other, whoever's in the house, when Mum will be commentating particularly the Rabbitohs. She's so funny. And of course, in recent years, I'm a ambassador for Adam Goodes and Michael Loughlin's Go Foundation, and of course, I wrote a book with them called Kicking Goals with Goodesy and Magic, and that, so my connection to the game and the Swans and so forth is really through them. And of course, I'm a Sydney girl, love Sydney. And when I think I wrote about it in Am I Black Enough for You, and I wrote about what happened to Adam over that period of time, and how I felt that the responsibility of the racism and the behaviour and just the extraordinary story that unfolded around that time really was the responsibility of Victoria, given that I think there was, 2/3 of the code were Victorian teams, and the commentators that were speaking about him in disgusting ways were Victorian commentators. So, my heart will always be in, I love Brisbane, but, I grew up in Bichigal Dharawal country, and my mum and my family are still there, aside from Wiradjuri country. So, I proudly grew up in Rabbitohs territory. We've got rabbits painted all over the street down there.
So being a Sydney girl, my sister, Larperouse, right? You worked with the Larper Kids, and there's a book there that you published, and I don't know the publishing house, but you can remind me.
It was published by ABC Books.
ABC
but I think
Books.
Maybe it's with and back in the day. So that
Yirra and her dog Demon.
Yirra and her deadly dog Demon.
And the deadly dog Demon.
And then Demon, we did the second follow-up book was Demon Guards the Schoolyard, and that was with Oxford University Press as part of the Yarning Strong series. Yep.
Tell me about your love for Larperouse and why you chose to work with the Larper Kids.
Well, I grew up at Matraville, which is just on the fringes of Larperouse. So I spent a lot of my youth at Larper Beach and Little Bay and Kongwong and so forth. And what happened was those books came about because I was on a plane from Mascot Airport to LA. I was with Professor Michael McDaniel and Wiradjuri man from Forbes, and we were travelling to the US to do a lecture series for Macquarie University across the country on peace and justice. And the plane's just pulling out of the Bay or whatever it's called. And we overhear this conversation between an American tourist and a guy from Melbourne, because we could hear their exchange. And the American guy says, oh, wow, I've just been in Australia for 6 weeks and I met a 4th generation Australian. That's pretty good, isn't it? And the Australian guy goes, wow, 4th generation Australian. You just don't get any more Australian than that. And Michael's like, what about 4,000th generation Australian? So I realised then, we're not even on the radar of back then of who is an Australian. Don't even exist for 4th generations, and that's the best you can do. And so I thought about it. At the time, there was like, everything was hyphenated. I called it a hyphenated Australian. So Chinese Australian, Greek Australian, Italian Australian, Anglo Australian. And the real Australians were those who could, trace their families back to the First Fleet and so forth. And so when we got back to Sydney, I went out to Larper and to the then principal, who was a friend of mine, the late Paul Trevini, who was an extraordinary man. And I said, I'd like to write some books with the kids. And I got a fellowship from the New South Wales Premier's Fellowship, and we were going to write 10 kids. We're going to write 5 picture books. But they came up with so much material that we ended up just writing a novel, which was more than 5 picture books anyway. And it's interesting now because so that was 2000, we started in 2004. The book came out in 2007. And then I bump into these kids who are now, I don't know, years later, I'm at the 7-Eleven at Maddo. And I said, how's school? And they're like, we finished school. So they're all, because it was so long ago, they're all grown up, and they actually became, that group of kids, years 4, 5 and 6, became the first group of Australian students to co-author a novel, which is just extraordinary. And then most of those kids went on to Maddo High or South Sydney or so forth. And then the second book we did with Oxford University Press, and that was about land management, living in the city, but still having respect for country and so forth. And also it talked about identity, because there's a scene in there where, there's an English kid who says to the Koori kid who's fair down at Bondi, he says something like, oh, I don't see any Aborigines around here. But, it's not the kid's fault. He's not being taught. And so we talk about that as well. And so they were the good old days, those good old days out there at Larper.
And you mentioned Professor Michael McDaniel, a colleague of yours, a good friend of yours, a brother, uncle.
Yeah.
I met him once, right? So if you're listening, big hello. I met him once at an event in Melbourne where Aunt Lilla received an award with higher education, something that was a big deal, and she was one of the recipients, and that's where we met Professor Michael McDaniel. You did some work with him at the Macquarie University. Yes.
That's correct. I would tell you, he was the director of Warrawa Aboriginal Centre Unit, whatever it was called back in the day. It's changed names now. And I for the first year, I was writer in residence for a year, and then I became his deputy. And we co-taught Indigenous Studies like 101, and I tell you, I have never ever seen anybody ever engage a lecture theatre of students the way he did. People were just like this, mesmerised. We did 2 lectures a week for 3 hours a week, 3 hours per lecture. He would have one piece of paper and a PowerPoint, and he was just the most extraordinary presence and probably one of the wisest men I have ever met. So to be able to work with him was, just an absolute joy. Yeah. And when he left, pretty much everyone else left too, because he was one of the reasons that people loved being there.
The anthology. There's a thing that you've developed, a resource for teachers, the pen resource.
Oh, the pen Macquarie.
The pen Macquarie.
And Anthology of Aboriginal Literature came out in 2007. Mint and I co-edited that. And that was really about bringing back into print and into the classroom works. Most of those works were no longer in print. So we've got everything from the first piece of published writing by a black fellow was Bennelong, and I think it was 1896. He wrote a letter to the governor, and then right up and finished in 2007 to Tara June Winch's, some text from Tara June Winch from Swallow the Air. So what that anthology does is got notes and so forth. It's been out now since came out in 2008. So however long, many years that is for the maths people out there. There's teachers' notes and a website and a whole lot of resources. But what we see captured is 81 contributions in that. There we see how the landscape changed over time, culturally, politically, socially, because it's all done chronologically. Yeah, that was a big job. Oh my goodness, could never do that again.
And then in terms of the work at UQ with black words, I was lit.
Yeah, so Black Words, I'm only 2 days a week with UQ, but I've been working on Black Words, paid and unpaid, since 2006 or 2007. So getting the job at UQ was just fantastic. I go, I get to do things I was doing anyway and love doing. So Black Words is a database, or research community really is a better term, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander writers and storytellers. There's just on 7,000 of us that have been indexed in there. It has essays and literary trails.
7,000. Anita, 7,000 First Nations authors in the country.
Published. So some of them have passed away.
Yes.
Yeah, so published writers and storytellers.
People ask me all the time, like, what do we read and how do I find them? And, people might go, there's Anita Heiss, there's Bruce Pascoe, there's Melissa Lukashenko, Tara June Winch, but there's 7,000.
And so I think... I'm an advocate for a national curriculum, and I love saying to teachers, I'm about to do a keynote to 400 teachers and PD in a session or workshop with 30 of those teachers, principals, in New South Wales in June. And, I say to them, I take great joy and pride in saying, I reckon I can find you a poem or a novel or a play or a memoir that touches on almost any subject, because we've got in the Young and Strong series, there's books that talk about mathematics, novels that has something about mathematics in there and science and so forth. It is, so when people say to me, why can't we read so-and-so until an Aboriginal person writes a history book? I go, our autobiographies are our history books. We need to stop thinking that you can only learn history or read about history through a text. And certainly you don't need to be reading it through the lens of a non-Indigenous academic or an anthropologist or a historian. Not that they don't have a role to play. But what I say to my students is, if I want to learn about farming, I'm going to read a book by a farmer, not a book by a stockbroker. So if I want to learn about what it's like to be an Aboriginal person growing up in Australia today, this is a proof card, I'm going to pick up Growing Up Aboriginal Australia Today.
I'm not going to
read a book.
There's a book on it.
I've got books everywhere. Spent some time in a community, a fly in, fly out. I'm going to read the words of the people who have lived an experience.
Yeah, and I think it's so important.
I don't know what the question was.
No, I love it. I was talking about literally the databases, and which you explained about there is a database out there, Black Words, 7,000 published authors in the country that are First Nations. So for people that are watching or listening, like literally go and do your research or grab a copy of Anita Heiss's book, Am I Black Enough for You? 10 years on, and everything is in there. You name authors, and also I got to say, I was so, it's not even feeling humbled or honoured. I can't even describe the feeling, Anita, of you mentioning Black Magic Woman podcast in the Oprah section. I finally found it, page 228, people.
I wasn't going to tell you because I wanted you to read the whole book, and I thought if I tell her what page it's on, she'll skip to that page. But, the thing is with that, I mentioned you because during COVID and at the beginning of last year, I started just every morning sitting in my back garden, which just runs into Maywa, under the gum trees, keep writing a journal and listening to the Oprah podcast. And so I've started listening to podcasts when I run and so forth. I should be listening to audiobooks because I'd get through far more books. But and I think from memory, when I was writing about you, I mentioned your podcast in the memoir, it was because your style of interviewing and so forth remind me of Oprah. And, I loved Oprah's show. I wanted to be Australia's Oprah. I went to the when she came to Australia, I went to the taping and so forth. And what I learned from her, and what I feel comes through in your podcasts as well, and the way you interview people, is her role. Oprah saw her role as providing a way for other people to tell their stories. Yeah. So she was saying, how can I make change in the world? What is the best way? So when she's in media, she's like, what is the best way that I can make change? What can I do? And she said, well, I can use my platform to help people. Yeah. Give people a chance to tell their stories. And I listened to, she now has a new podcast called Soul Sundays. Is it called Soul Sundays? Anyway, and I listen to that when I run. And I'll be honest with you, there's not a lot in there that's new about the way to look at the world or to look at ourselves. But every single time, they go for 35 minutes, maybe not even that long, I come away with a reminder of, yes, be kinder to yourself. Don't do this. Don't do that, and I think that's what's really good.
And talking about Oprah, I'm going to jump to Obama. So you was actually in the US when Obama became president.
I was in Harlem the day that he was inaugurated, and I really went. I mean, we had a big party in Sydney the night of the election when he won in 2008. Huge ABC friends at the ABC organised that, Rhianna Patrick and a few other friends, and we had a great party, and then we went to the Democrats' party in the city somewhere after that. But I was researching Manhattan Dreaming. So I'd worked out I have a whole schedule when I'm researching. So I have X amount of days. Every single day I have mapped out of where I've got to be based on, geography. I'm going to be in this part of town. I'll do this, and this. And I was emailing everyone, my friends in New York, saying, what's everyone doing for Inauguration Day? And like, oh, look, it was really big on Election Day. Inauguration Day is not that, it's big. Most people were going down to Washington, D.C., which I didn't want to do. Anyway, so I found out that there was something on at some Armory Hall up in Harlem. I think it housed about 5,000 people. So I got the train up there with my expat friend Matilda. So we went up there, and oh my God. So we're standing there, and there's all these thousands of people chanting Obama. It was just incredible. All these school kids were at tables with pens and paper and things to make posters, and we watched some of the ceremony live, but there was performances, and I got goosebumps, because what we saw, and we talked about it back then, is we saw the potential for Black people internationally to be in those positions of power. And I always joke that we are the 51st state of the USA, because everything that happens there impacts us. So, we see a Black man in the White House. And for me, I was like, maybe one day we'll have a Black president of the Republic of Australia. And so I got to write, so anyone's interested in reading fiction, I wrote Manhattan Dreaming, and the dollar was really bad. Then it was right after the global financial crisis. I think the dollar was worth 66 cents, and every single thing I did, I had to go, I've got to get a few thousand words out of this. And that night, there was a concert at Carnegie Hall it was part of the G'day Australia campaign. And William Barton played. He played the didge walking down the aisle. Yeah. Extraordinary. And on stage, he played the didge and the electric guitar at the same time. Ursula Jovic was there, and she sang Somewhere Over the Rainbow from the movie Australia. But I'm like, and the late Gurrumul Yunupingu, he performed in language and with the subtitles up on the screen, in English. And I was just sobbing, and my friends are going, you okay? It was the most extraordinary experience, because Carnegie Hall is possibly one of the greatest man-made cultural sacred sites in the world. I'm going, here's all these Black fellas performing, but I'm also sitting there going, this ticket's just cost me $200. I need to get 2,000 words out of this. So, that's how research works. True.
In terms of your chick lit, right, Sex and the City, there's a chapter there. I started reading about Kari in Sex and the City. I actually didn't watch Sex and the City that much, and you didn't watch it either for like 8 years. No TV, and then people were calling you like the Black Kari or something like that.
Oh, I didn't. I watched it. Yeah, I watched it late. I'm behind everybody on everything.
Too. So I don't do TV and I don't watch films. So I'm like, when people go, did you watch the film? Remember that part? And especially at a barbecue, I look at my husband who watches every single film and even goes to the cinemas on his own. And here I am going,
love going to the cinema by myself. So I hadn't read it, hadn't watched it, but I watched it when I must have been researching. Well, maybe it was the next trip to Manhattan. I watched the whole series because, cold and alone, and watched DVD after DVD. But there was a lot of, my research in Manhattan and Manhattan Dreaming is very different to the life of Sex in the City. I wanted to do Sex in the Suburbs. But what happened was when it came out, I jokingly said to a journalist, I'm Corey Bradshaw, and then I wrote a couple of travel articles under the name of Corey Bradshaw, and pretended that in the articles that I wrote them from the perspective that I was on a research trip and that we did this today, we did that today, and so forth. And then actually I came back from Honolulu on Easter Sunday, and I watched the latest version, which is called Just Like That. And it was interesting because for me as a writer, I just need a little piece of inspiration. It might be half an hour and I get one thing out of it. And also it's okay to relax. It's okay to relax. And our days generally are full of the politics of being Black, the politics of social justice and so forth. At the end of the day, I don't need to watch a documentary, or I can just chill and watch, I don't know, Friends or whatever, Big Bang Theory, and have a laugh.
Yeah, but I love the fact that you set yourself a target of what? In 5 years you're going to launch 4? Chick lit or black lit, chocolate? What was
What? Did I set myself a target?
You set yourself, and then you started coming out with these books.
What happened? So Not Meeting Mr. Right came out in 2007, Avoiding Mr. Right 2008, Manhattan Dreaming in 2010, and Paris Dreaming in 2011. Yes, so 4 years. There you go.
There you go.
But see,
what happens?
They expect you, like 6 weeks after Not Meeting Mr. Right came out, the publisher says, okay, we need the next book. And apparently you've got to just keep doing that. So the readers are expecting and waiting and so forth. And then, of course, I turned 40 and it was too old to write them.
Well, I love the fact that you have inspired.
Pen lit.
But you
Auntie lit.
Auntie lit. Old girl lit.
Old girl lit. OG lit.
You have inspired a whole lot of First Nations, I guess, writers, authors, publishers to write commercial fiction.
Fiction, yeah.
And you were one of the first, when you think about going back, you were one of the first First Nations authors in that commercial fiction. Would you say that?
Well, there's first of all, I hate categories. I think we all just write books. But so there's commercial fiction is fiction that is written for a mass audience. So with broad themes, with language, it's for a mass audience. So I write, they call it popular fiction. So I write that. So my books are in Big W and the airport and so forth. And I sell a lot of books because I write commercially. And you look at a cover, like the commercial covers, those chick lit covers, they are very different to a literary work. So very, very different. My work is very different to Alexis Wright or Melissa Lukashenko's or Tara Jen Winch's. So my work won't win literary awards because it's not classified as literary fiction. And so I don't get upset about that. I actually just want people to read my books. I don't write for awards, but there are those different categories. And chick lit, for the listeners and viewers out there, there's a hierarchy that has chick lit right at the bottom of the rung of, worthiness, just above Westerns, which nobody writes anymore. So when I run chick lit workshops, I have to say that you need to understand that you are going to be regarded right down here in the literary world.
Wow.
But that's okay because I write, but people read those books. Yeah. So I started writing chick lit because I wanted to reach those women in book clubs or who read chick lit but may never, ever, ever have thought about the anti-intervention or Black deaths in custody or Indigenous intellectual property. But they'll read a book about relationships and shopping, which is why I wrote about Manhattan Dreaming. And within that, there's a whole lot of identity and so forth.
I absolutely love it. And I just love your passion for reading and the investment and the focus, especially on young Indigenous kids, young First Nations kids, learning, not just learning to read, but love to love reading. And I struggle to get my kids to read, Anita, and I now want to read. I want them to see me reading, and I don't want to punish them, because I can tell you now, when they're naughty and they're being silly, what do? All right, get your homework out, get a book. Yeah. So now what I'm doing, from your book, from reading your book, and that teacher, when you're out in a community, a teacher basically was punishing the kids by saying, you're going to miss out on this activity and I'm going to get you to do some reading. And you were like, no, yeah. I've spent my life to get to a point to get kids to read. I know.
Instead of saying, okay, if you're well behaved, you get to go and read a book. Having said that, in most of those communities I've been to, their libraries did not have books that were remotely relevant to those kids. They were all in English. So the kids possibly couldn't even read the books in the library. So, I'm just thinking that now. But what I was going to say to you, why don't you take, and I've also just thought about this now too, not having children myself, it could be a bad idea. What about taking your children to the library and saying, okay, go and pick 3 books for the week. And if they actually can go and look around and spend some time and have control and a bit of power in the situation, they might actually go. So it's a bit of an outing. Maybe you could sit in the library in a beanbag for half an hour and go, okay, we're going to read 1 book here and we're going to take 2 home.
Yeah.
Look at me, Auntie. Got it all sorted.
Auntie, I get sent all of these books, and now I'm getting my children to read. So the older one, Lameki, has been reading Marcia Langton's Welcome to Country. So he's actually reading and he's educating himself about his culture instead of just picking up a novel or a book. And Jida said, well, what book am I going to read? And I said, well, let's start with Sea Country. So he's in grade 5. Yeah. And because there's some long words, hard words, Aboriginal, and I said, it's all right, sound it out. And Tiger Lily's saying, Mum, that's my book. Let me read that book. So Tiger Lily loves the picture books and she doesn't want Jida to read her books. So I've got Lameki a book, got Tiger Lily a book, and now in the middle I've got to find Jida a book. And today, when I got my pack of them out from Magabala with that missing tracks, I literally said to my husband, this book's for Jida. So I'm going to get Jida to read that and hopefully, get that passion and love for reading. But your association with the Indigenous Literacy Foundation, and you are a lifetime ambassador, I really want to raise their profile here just for a moment and say that up until mid-2021, they had given, over at least 400 remote Indigenous communities in Australia about 350,000 books. That's extraordinary. And there are a lot of partners. You said there's a lot of people behind them and supporting them. So there's some amazing people out there doing some amazing things, but they also have a publishing community program as well where they've published.
Yeah, so it's an across-industry, not-for-profit, it's across-industry strategy with booksellers, publishers and authors, but also illustrators and other artists have come on board. And everybody donates their time except for, a core staff who all work so incredibly hard. And so what it's about is it is 3 parts of the strategy. There is Book Buzz, where books are delivered into the community. The community chooses the books that they want with a literacy worker. We don't just dump books. They're all brand new books, because our kids deserve to have beautiful new books like everybody else. Then we have Book Buzz, which are little backpacks of books, little board books, because some of the research found that in most remote communities, there were kids not having a relationship with a book until they started school. And so they're already behind the 8 ball compared to kids in the city. And the third part is a publishing arm. So I think it's over 100 books published. 2/3 of those are books that are in language or bilingual. So books like the Very Hungry Little Caterpillar has been made into a bilingual book with permission of the original author. And the books that are the publishing arm of the foundation, publishes books by request of communities working with people on the ground. So some of our ambassadors include people like Andy Griffiths, who's extraordinary, and he goes out and can write a book with the kids in 2 days or 2 minutes, and Alison Lester, they go out and write and illustrate and so forth, and it's not a fly in fly out thing, it's actually a long-term relationship. And so I've worked on 3 anthologies actually, one with girls from Tiwi College, one with a group of boys from up in Katherine who are young footballers from all around Australia, mainly in TWA, and we wrote a book called Shock 'em with Sandra Phillips, came up with me for that. and a book with the girls from Warra Aboriginal Girls College in Healesville, which is a boarding school with two-way learning, and girls from all around the country. And they wrote a book called Sisters. I think it's called Sisters Talking. Can't remember. Sorry.
I absolutely love it that we're going to have this all in the show notes. But in terms of where to now, what's going on, Anita? What are you working on? Can you share with us anything? Something?
I've got the kids version of Bila Yarudhanggalangdhuray, the novel about the Great Flood of Gadigal, which came out last year. I wrote a kids version of that, comes out. We're launching that on the anniversary of the flood next year in June. I've got a kids novel coming out through Magabala Books in November that's titled The Courier Princess. Ooh. For all our little princesses out there.
Tiger Lily would love that one.
You will. And then I've got a residency to Paris that I was meant for the Ministry Aid Council I was meant to use 2 years ago. Then we had COVID, so I'm going in December for 3 months, and I'll be working on my new epic historical novel called Dhuuluu-Yala, which is a Wiradjuri phrase meaning to rise up, and it's looking at Wiradjuri resistance on country, Bathurst, Mudgee through to Gadigal back into Canberra, and I'll work on that, and that will come out in 2024. But I think that's enough, really, and everything else,
and life. And you've also got T-shirts. Wow. There are T-shirts our people can get their hands on. How can we get one? And I know avid book readers in West End, there was T-shirts being sold there.
If you're an avid reader, have a few. I would give a call. Avid reader in West End, they're on Boundary Street, 193 Boundary Street. Give them a call if you're local, or you just get on the Dark and Disturbing website and you can order it online. And so I went to the warehouse today. They just ordered some more in because we sold quite a few last month. And so that's really exciting just to be in partnership with Vernon, our key, obviously. And it's a whole new line, and the line is called I Am. And so the first one is, am I black enough for you? Yes, I am.
And perfect timing with the launch of your books. I just want to say on that note, there is so much more I want to talk about. So we have to come back and do part 2 because we've missed all of the chapters and even the one right at the end. Why read black? Right? There's a whole lot. There's so much there for everyone, for young people, First Nations people, for educators, just to get an insight into your life, your experiences, your connections, your networks, your jobs, your family, your history, and the fact that there's so much, on a positive note, there's so much name dropping. And I know you're doing it for a reason. You are introducing to your readers black excellence, black people, black success. And I just want to say, just to get a little mention in your book, I felt absolutely honoured that I was in there. I wasn't expecting it. But I just can't wait for people to read the book. So get out there and read it.
Just for your listeners, there is a list in the back of the book of all the books that I talk about within the memoir. And finally, rather than name dropping, it was me acknowledging people who have been part of my journey, but also now I think about it when you're talking, it's also this is how we elevate each other's voices wherever we can, like through the podcast, wherever I can. I want to say, read this, go there, do that, see that.
And I love the fact that you've basically rephrased it or even corrected me, because in the whitefellow world, it's like name dropping. Yep, I know that person, connected to that person, good friends with that person. But in our world, it's elevating and amplifying black voices. So thank you. Love it. So big loves. Thank you so much for being the first guest on the Black Magic Woman Book Club series. And I can't wait to see who's next. So on that note, enjoy the rest of your afternoon. I can't wait to see you. Maybe I'll come running with you. It's still there. It's still on the list.
In Wiradjuri, I say Nurulnindu. Love you.
Love you.
See you soon. Bye. Keep reading.
Thank you.
Don't forget to follow Black Magic Woman podcast on all social media platforms. To keep up to date with the latest episodes and news, head to blackmagicwoman.com.au. You can rate and review the podcast on iTunes, and please feel free to share the podcast with your family and friends.